My name is Lena Carter. I'm 30 years old, and 3 days before my wedding, I discovered that my own mother had quietly erased the entire event behind my back. Not postponed it. Not suggested changes. Erased it. The florist I had booked 6 months earlier suddenly had no record of my order. The catering company said the reception had been canceled. Even the small lakeside venue where Daniel and I were supposed to say our vows told me they had received a call requesting a full cancellation. The caller had used my name, and according to every single vendor, that caller was my mother. If you've never planned a wedding before, you might not understand how carefully every piece fits together. Months of phone calls, contracts, deposits, emails saved in folders. Every detail carefully placed so that one single day can unfold without chaos. In less than a week, my mother had dismantled all of it. The flowers I spent hours choosing. The barbecue dinner Daniel insisted on because it reminded him of summer nights growing up. The wooden arch we were going to stand under by the water. Gone. But that still wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what she told Daniel. I didn't hear it directly from her. Daniel told me that night, sitting at our kitchen table with his hands folded together like he was trying to hold something fragile in place. "Your mom called me yesterday," he said quietly. There was a strange tension in his voice. Not anger, not confusion, something more careful than that. "She said you had a history of mental issues." For a moment, I didn't understand what he meant. The words felt distant, like someone speaking through a wall. Mental issues? Daniel looked straight at me, his eyes steady but searching. "She said you had a breakdown years ago, that you were unstable, that marrying you might be the biggest mistake of my life." The room went silent after that. I could hear the refrigerator humming behind us. A car passing slowly down our street. Somewhere outside, a dog barked once and then stopped. My mother had said those words about me, not to a stranger. Not to gossiping neighbors. To the man I was supposed to marry in 3 days. And she hadn't said it out of concern. She said it to make him leave. What my mother expected was simple. She thought Daniel would panic, that he would question everything, that he would decide marrying me was too complicated and quietly step away before the wedding even happened. She had been trying to push people away from me my entire life. Friends, boyfriends, co-workers. Anyone who got too close eventually heard some version of the same story, that Lena was fragile, difficult, unstable. Most people never stayed long enough to question it. But Daniel didn't leave. Instead, he sat across from me at our small kitchen table that night and said something I will never forget. "I don't see someone broken, Lena. I see someone who survived everything that tried to break her." And that was the moment I realized something terrifying. My mother wasn't trying to protect me. She was trying to destroy the one life I had finally started building without her. 3 days before the wedding, every vendor was gone. My reputation in town had already been poisoned. And according to my mother's plan, 180 guests were about to arrive at an empty venue where nothing existed except silence and humiliation. But what she didn't know was that someone else had already seen this coming months earlier. But to understand how everything started falling apart 3 days before my wedding, you have to go back about 6 months to the night Daniel asked me to marry him. It didn't happen in a fancy restaurant or during some elaborate surprise the way you see online. There were no hidden cameras, no violin music, no crowd of strangers clapping when I said yes. Daniel proposed in the most Daniel way possible. In his garage. Daniel owns a small auto repair shop just outside a quiet Texas town about 40 minutes north of Austin. It's the kind of place where pickup trucks line up in the parking lot every morning, and most customers know him by name. The shop smells permanently like motor oil and rubber tires, and the big metal doors rattle when the wind pushes against them. That night he had stayed late fixing an old Ford pickup for a customer who couldn't afford a full repair. I brought dinner over because I knew he would forget to eat otherwise. When I walked in, he was bent over the engine, with a flashlight between his teeth. He looked up, surprised. "Give me a second," he said quickly, wiping his hands on a rag. I leaned against the tool cabinet and waited while he disappeared into the tiny office in the back of the garage. I assumed he was grabbing plates or maybe looking for somewhere clean to put the food. Instead, he came back holding a small cardboard box. Not the velvet kind you expect, just a plain little box that looked like it once held spark plugs. Daniel stood there for a moment, like he had forgotten how conversations worked. "Lena," he said, rubbing the back of his neck. "I'm not great at speeches." I laughed softly. That was the most predictable sentence he could have said. "I know." He opened the box. Inside was a small ring. Nothing flashy, just a simple silver band with a modest stone that caught the overhead fluorescent light. Later, he told me he'd been putting money aside for 7 months. "I don't have a big house yet," he said, glancing around the garage like he suddenly noticed the oil stains on the floor. "And the roof in here still leaks when it rains." My chest tightened a little. "But every morning I wake up," he continued carefully, "I realize there's only one thing I'm completely sure about." He took a breath. "I want my life to start with you." For a moment, the entire garage felt quiet in a way that's hard to explain. Not empty quiet, but the kind where everything in your world suddenly settles into place. I didn't let him finish whatever else he had planned to say. "Yes," I said immediately. Daniel blinked. "You didn't even hear the rest." "I don't need to." We both started laughing then. The nervous kind that comes after a huge moment when you suddenly realize it actually happened. We ended up sitting on the concrete floor afterward, leaning against an old red tool cabinet while I kept turning my hand under the light, watching the ring flash every time it moved. For those first few minutes, everything felt simple. Just the two of us in that quiet garage, eating takeout noodles from a plastic container and talking about the future like it was something bright and uncomplicated waiting down the road. Then my phone rang. I didn't even have to check the screen to know who it was. My mother had an almost supernatural timing when it came to important moments in my life. I answered while I was still smiling. "Hi, Mom." She didn't ask how the proposal happened. She didn't say congratulations. The first thing she said was, "Where are you planning to have the wedding?" I hesitated. "We haven't decided yet," I said. "Daniel literally proposed 10 minutes ago." "Well, you need to start looking immediately," she replied briskly. "Good venues book months ahead. If you wait too long, you'll be stuck with somewhere embarrassing." I glanced over at Daniel. He was watching me with a curious expression, like he was trying to read the conversation just from my face. "We were thinking of planning it ourselves," I said gently. There was a pause on the line. Not a long one. Just long enough to feel it. Then my mother sighed. "Oh," she said quietly. The single word carried a weight I recognized instantly. "I understand," she continued after a moment. "You don't need me anymore." The guilt came fast, the way it always did. "No, Mom," I said quickly. "Of course I do." Another pause. Then her voice warmed again, smooth and reassuring. "Well," she said calmly, "then let me help. I'll start making a few calls tomorrow." Across the garage, Daniel tilted his head slightly, studying me. I smiled at him and gave a small shrug, like the conversation was completely normal. At the time, I believed it was. Looking back now, that phone call feels different. It was small, almost ordinary, but sometimes the moments that change your life don't announce themselves. Sometimes they arrive quietly disguised as help. Looking back now, I can see that the phone call in Daniel's garage only felt small because I had spent most of my life mistaking control for love. My father died when I was 19. It happened so suddenly that for a long time, my mind kept replaying the ordinary parts of that day instead of the ending. The sound of the lawnmower outside. The iced tea he had left sweating on the kitchen counter. The way he called into the house 10 minutes earlier, asking if I had seen his work gloves. Then the ambulance came. 3 days later, we buried him at the little cemetery, just outside town, where the oak trees leaned over the road, like they were trying to listen. After the service, people filled our house with casseroles, paper plates, and soft voices. Everyone looked at my mother with the same expression, pity first, then admiration, as if surviving the worst thing that could happen to a woman somehow made her holy. I remember standing in the kitchen, while people moved through the living room, in black dresses and dark suits, balancing food they were too sad to eat. My mother pulled me aside and took both my hands in hers. Her fingers were cold. "It's just us now," she whispered. "You're all I have left." At 19, that sentence didn't sound dangerous. It sounded like love. It sounded like loyalty. It sounded like a daughter being handed a responsibility she was supposed to be proud of. So, I accepted it without questioning what it would cost me. Over the next few years, that sentence seemed to follow me everywhere, not spoken out loud every time, but always there underneath whatever my mother wanted from me. When I chose a college farther from home, she cried and asked why I was so eager to leave her alone. When I changed my major from business to education, she said my father would have wanted something more practical. When I signed a lease on my first apartment after graduation, she came with me to look at it, smiled through the tour, and then spent the drive home explaining why the neighborhood didn't feel safe. None of it looked dramatic from the outside. That was the problem. There were no screaming fights, no threats, no slammed doors, just pauses, sighs, wounded silence, and the kind of disappointment that makes you feel cruel for wanting a life of your own. After a while, I stopped making choices cleanly. Every decision came with a quiet calculation in the background. How upset would my mother be? And was I willing to pay for it? By the time Daniel proposed, that habit was already built into me. So, when my mother offered to help with the wedding, I said yes almost automatically. Part of me was relieved. I was teaching third grade full-time. Daniel was working long days at the garage, and wedding planning had started to feel like a second job neither of us knew how to manage. At first, her help looked harmless. She offered to call a few florists while I was at school. She said she knew 2 caterers from church events who might give us a decent price. She started sending venue links in the evenings, usually with comments like, "Just helping narrow things down," or "You two have enough on your plate." And because I was used to letting her step in, I didn't notice when helping slowly turned into deciding. The first time it really hit me was at the florist. I had gone downtown after work to look at sample arrangements because I'd always imagined something simple for the wedding: sunflowers, wild greenery, little sprigs of lavender in mason jars. Nothing polished, nothing too formal, just something warm and alive. The woman behind the counter smiled when I gave her my name, typed a few things into her computer, and then hesitated. "Oh," she said. "Your mother already finalized everything." She turned the screen toward me. White roses. Tight, perfect, expensive-looking arrangements that belonged in a ballroom wedding, not at the laid-back lakeside ceremony Daniel and I had talked about. "I think there's been a mistake," I said. The florist glanced back at the notes. "No mistake, honey. Your mother was very specific." That night, I called my mother and tried gently to tell her it wasn't what I wanted. She let me finish, then sighed. "Lena, wildflowers look messy," she said. "I'm trying to make this day elegant for you." For a second, I almost pushed back harder. Then came the silence. That familiar silence. The one that made me feel selfish, childish, ungrateful. And just like that, the conversation ended the way so many others had before it, with me backing down. A week later, she changed the caterer too. When Daniel saw her email attached to yet another vendor thread, he looked up from the kitchen table and asked, very carefully, "Why does it feel like your mom is planning our wedding instead of us?" I wanted to answer him, but the truth was, I was starting to ask myself the same thing. When Daniel asked that question at the kitchen table, I didn't answer right away. Not because I hadn't heard him, but because something about the way he said it made the truth feel a little harder to ignore. I stared at the laptop screen between us. Another email thread with a vendor was open, and my mother's name appeared several times in the conversation, each message a little more confident than the last, like someone slowly stepping further into a room they already believed belonged to them. Daniel waited quietly. He had always been patient like that. "I guess she's just trying to help," I said eventually. Even as I said it, the explanation sounded thin. Daniel didn't argue. He simply leaned back in his chair and folded his arms loosely. "It's our wedding, Lena," he said. I know, and I did know. The problem was that knowing something and actually pushing back against it were two very different things. Over the next few weeks, my mother's involvement didn't slow down. If anything, it became more confident. At first, it was little things. One afternoon, she called while I was on my way home from school. "I've been thinking about the seating," she said. "We haven't finalized the seating yet," I replied. "Well, now we have a starting point," she said lightly. "I moved the Cole family to the second row. My friends from church will sit in front." I frowned slightly. "Mom, shouldn't Daniel's family be in the front?" There was a brief silence on the line. Then came the soft sigh I knew too well. "I'm only thinking about how things look to guests," she said gently. "Weddings have certain expectations." By the time the conversation drifted to something else, the seating chart had quietly become her version instead of ours. A few days later, something similar happened with the music. Daniel had found a local DJ he liked. Someone relaxed, someone who understood the laid-back atmosphere we wanted for the reception. Then an email arrived, asking if everything was okay. Apparently, my mother had already called to cancel. She said the family decided to go in a different direction, the DJ wrote. When I asked my mother about it, she brushed the question aside. "He didn't sound very professional," she said. "You want someone with experience." Each change was small enough to explain away on its own. But slowly, the pattern began to form. One evening, Daniel came home from the garage and found me sitting at the kitchen table, surrounded by paperwork, contracts, invoices, printouts from vendors. "You look like you're studying for a final exam," he said with a small smile. "It feels like one." He pulled out the chair across from me and started flipping through the stack. After a moment, his brow creased. "Why is your mom's phone number on all of these?" My stomach tightened. I leaned forward and took one of the papers from him. There it was. Client contact information. My mother's number, not mine. I checked another contract. Same thing. At some point, quietly, gradually, vendors had stopped calling me. They were calling her instead. When I asked my mother about it that night, she didn't sound defensive. She sounded almost amused. "Well, of course they call me," she said. "I've been coordinating everything." "But it's my wedding," I said. "And I'm your mother." Her voice was calm, certain, as if the explanation should have settled the matter immediately. "You're busy teaching all day," she continued. "Daniel's at the garage. Someone has to make sure everything is done properly." I sat on the edge of my bed, with the phone pressed to my ear, trying to hold on to the pieces of the wedding Daniel and I had originally imagined. "I wanted the wildflowers," I said quietly. "You'll thank me for the roses." "I wanted the barbecue dinner." "You can't serve barbecue at a wedding." The conversation ended the way so many others had before it. Not with an argument. Not with a decision. Just a quiet shift of control that somehow always seemed to land in her hands. And for the first time since we started planning the wedding, a thought crossed my mind that I couldn't shake. Maybe the celebration Daniel and I had been dreaming about was no longer ours to plan. Maybe the celebration Daniel and I had been dreaming about was no longer ours to plan. That thought lingered with me for days after our conversation at the kitchen table. I tried to push it aside, telling myself I was overthinking things, that wedding planning was stressful for everyone. But then my mother did something that made ignoring the problem impossible. It started with a phone call to Daniel. I didn't even know about it until later that evening. He was wiping his hands on a shop rag when he walked into the kitchen, the familiar smell of engine oil following him inside. I was rinsing dishes in the sink when he said it casually, like it wasn't anything unusual. "Your mom asked me to have lunch with her tomorrow." I turned off the faucet and looked over my shoulder. "Lunch?" "Yeah," he said. "Just the two of us." That small knot of tension returned to my stomach. "What for?" He shrugged slightly. "She said she wants to talk about family." Part of me wanted to believe that meant progress. Maybe my mother was finally ready to accept that Daniel wasn't going anywhere. Maybe this was her way of trying to start fresh. "Where are you meeting?" I asked. "The diner. By the square. I nodded slowly. Let me know how it goes. The next day, Daniel met her there around noon. It's the kind of diner everyone in town knows the place, with cracked vinyl booths, bottomless coffee, and the same group of retired men sitting at the counter every morning arguing about local politics. When Daniel told me about it later, he said the conversation had started out perfectly normal. My mother asked about the garage first. How long have you been running the shop? She asked while stirring cream into her coffee. About 4 years, Daniel told her. And business is steady? Steady enough. She nodded approvingly, like she was checking items off a list. Then she asked about his parents, his sister, where he grew up, the kinds of polite questions people ask when they're trying to appear welcoming. Daniel said he thought maybe the lunch really was meant to clear the air, until she asked about college. So, she said, leaning forward slightly, has Lena ever told you about her sophomore year? Daniel told her I had mentioned losing my dad during college. That must have been hard, he said. My mother gave a slow, sympathetic nod. Yes, she said, it was. Then she added something else. She didn't handle it very well. Daniel paused. What do you mean? My mother took a careful sip of coffee before answering, the way people do when they want their words to sound thoughtful instead of cruel. She had what I would call a breakdown, she said. Daniel frowned slightly. A breakdown? She couldn't get out of bed for weeks, my mother continued. She stopped going to classes. I had to drive up there more than once to try to get her back on her feet. Daniel listened, without interrupting. She saw a counselor for a while, my mother added, which was probably for the best. From the outside, what she was saying might have sounded concerned. But Daniel said there was something about the way she spoke that didn't feel like concern. It felt like a warning. She can be fragile, my mother continued quietly. Grief affects people differently. Some recover, some don't. Daniel leaned back slightly in the booth. Lena's never seemed fragile to me. My mother tilted her head. Well, she said softly, people are often strongest right before they fall apart. That was the moment Daniel understood the real purpose of the lunch. It wasn't about welcoming him into the family. It was about planting doubt. When he told me all of this later that night, we were sitting on the back porch steps with the late evening air settling around us. The cicadas were loud in the trees, and the porch light cast a soft yellow circle across the yard. What did you say to her? I asked quietly. Daniel rested his elbows on his knees for a moment, before answering. I told her something pretty simple. I waited. I told her I didn't see someone broken. He turned slightly and looked at me. I see someone who lost her dad at 19 and still built a life anyway. Something in my chest tightened. And your mom? I asked. Daniel exhaled slowly. She didn't like that answer, he said. Then after a moment, he added one more thing. But she definitely wasn't finished trying. At first, nothing obvious happened after Daniel told me about the lunch. Life went on the way it normally did. Monday morning, I stood in front of my classroom, writing multiplication problems on the whiteboard, while 22 third graders argued about whose turn it was to feed the class hamster. The ordinary rhythm of the school day usually grounded me. Kids that age only cared about math worksheets, recess, and whether the cafeteria pizza was edible. But that week, something felt different. It started with little things. When I walked into Miller's grocery after work one afternoon, Mrs. Caldwell from church stopped me near the produce section. She held my hand a little longer than usual. Sweetheart, she said gently, marriage is a big step. There's no shame in taking your time. I blinked at her. Taking my time? She gave a sympathetic smile, but didn't explain further. I brushed the moment off as awkward small talk. In a town our size, people often spoke in half-finished thoughts. Still, the exchange left a strange feeling behind, like hearing the second half of a conversation without knowing how it started. 2 days later, something similar happened again. I stopped by the post office on my way home from school to pick up a package of classroom supplies. The clerk behind the counter had known me since I was a teenager. As she handed me the box, she lowered her voice. You doing okay, Lena? The question sounded careful. Too careful. I'm fine, I said, forcing a small smile. She nodded, but the expression on her face didn't quite match the conversation. By Thursday afternoon, the pattern was impossible to ignore. That was the day I walked into Patty's salon. Patty had been cutting my hair since I was 14. Her shop sat across from the pharmacy on Main Street, with a faded red awning and a little brass bell on the door that jingled every time someone walked in. It was the kind of place where people came as much for conversation as for haircuts. Patty wrapped the cape around my shoulders and began combing through my hair. "So," she said casually, "how are you holding up?" The question sounded almost identical to the one from the post office. I met her eyes in the mirror. "Holding up from what?" The comb slowed. "Oh, honey." My stomach tightened. What did my mom say? Patty hesitated just long enough to confirm the answer. "She stopped by yesterday," Patty admitted. "She mentioned you've been under a lot of pressure lately. Said the wedding might be happening too fast." I stared at my reflection. "That's not true." "I figured it probably wasn't," Patty said quickly. "Your mama just sounded worried." But Patty wasn't the only one who had heard it. Over the next couple of days, the same strange conversations kept happening. An older woman from my mother's Bible study hugged me tightly after church and whispered, "We're praying for you." One of the parents from my class approached me in the school parking lot and asked if I was feeling overwhelmed with everything going on. No one said the words directly. They didn't need to. The sympathy in their voices carried the rest of the story. By the end of the week, the truth settled in with a quiet certainty that made my chest feel heavy. My mother had started talking. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just small conversations here and there, framed like concern. The kind of comments that spread easily in a town where everyone knew each other's parents, cousins, and church pew. The story she was telling was simple. That I was fragile. That planning the wedding had been too much pressure. That I might not be ready for marriage after all. Friday evening, I pulled into our driveway, feeling like the entire town had taken one careful step back from me. Daniel was standing beside his truck, wiping grease from his hands with a rag. "You look exhausted," he said when I got out of the car. I walked slowly across the gravel. "Did my mom call you again?" He shook his head. "No." "Why?" I hesitated before answering. "She's been talking to people." Daniel's expression sharpened instantly. "What kind of talking?" I stared down at the driveway. "She's telling them I'm not stable enough to get married." The words sounded unreal when I said them out loud. Daniel was quiet for a moment. Then he straightened up and tossed the rag into the bed of the truck. "That's not meddling anymore," he said. "That's sabotage." Standing there in the fading evening light, I felt the final piece of the situation click into place. My mother wasn't just trying to control the wedding. She was trying to make sure the wedding never happened at all. Daniel didn't say anything else after he called it sabotage, but the words stayed with me the rest of the night. I lay awake long after the house went quiet, staring at the ceiling while pieces of the last few weeks slowly rearranged themselves in my head. The florist changing the flowers, the DJ suddenly canceling, vendors responding to my mother's emails instead of mine. At the time, each thing had felt small enough to explain away. Now they didn't. By the time morning light slipped through the kitchen window, I was already sitting at the table with my laptop open and a stack of contracts spread out in front of me. Daniel came in a few minutes later from the garage, 2 mugs of coffee in his hands. "You've been up for a while," he said. "I need to check something," I replied. He set the coffee down beside me and leaned against the counter while I scrolled through the vendor folder. For the first time, I noticed something that should have caught my attention weeks ago. Next to the client contact section on several contracts, my mother's phone number had replaced mine. Daniel noticed it too. "That wasn't there before, was it?" he asked quietly. "No." The realization made my stomach twist. Somewhere along the way, the vendors had started treating my mother as the main contact. I picked up my phone. "Let's confirm everything," Daniel said. I nodded. The florist answered first. "Magnolia Floral Design, this is Karen." "Hi, Karen," I said. "This is Lena Carter. I just wanted to confirm our wedding order for next month." There was a short pause. Then the sound of typing. Another pause. "Oh," Karen said. Something in the tone made my chest tighten. "Oh, what?" "Well, according to our notes, the event was cancelled last week." My fingers went cold around the phone. "Cancelled?" "Yes," she said carefully. "Your mother called and said the wedding was off. She confirmed she was handling things for you." Daniel straightened beside me. "That's not correct," I said quickly. "The wedding is absolutely still happening." Karen sounded confused. "Oh," she told us she was the contact person now. I assumed everything had been discussed. I ended the call slowly and stared down at the contract in front of me. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Daniel slid the caterer's contract toward me. "Call them." I did. The answer came quickly this time. "Yes, Miss Carter," the man said apologetically after checking the reservation. "We processed the cancellation earlier this week. Your mother called and confirmed it." My heart started beating faster. Did she say why? She told us the wedding had been called off. 2 vendors. Daniel was already reaching for the venue information. "Try the lake." I hesitated for a moment before dialing. The woman who managed the lakeside venue answered in the same gentle tone she had used the day we first booked the place. "Lakeside Pavilion." "Hi," I said. "This is Lena Carter. I'm calling about the Carter wedding reservation next month." Silence. Then a quiet sigh. "Oh, Lena." My throat tightened. "What happened?" "Your mother called a few days ago," she said carefully. "She told us the wedding had been cancelled. 3 calls, 3 cancellations. Every single vendor we had booked for the wedding was gone." The kitchen felt strangely still around us, like the house itself was holding its breath. Daniel ran a hand through his hair and stared at the contracts spread across the table. "She cancelled everything." I nodded slowly. "And she did it, pretending to be me." For a moment, we both just stood there. Outside, sunlight stretched across the driveway, exactly the way it did every morning. A neighbor's dog barked somewhere down the street. Nothing in the world looked different. But sitting there with the empty contracts in front of us, the scale of what my mother had done finally became clear. The rumors around town hadn't come first. They had come second. First, she removed the wedding. Then, she started telling people why it supposedly wasn't happening. And suddenly the story she had been spreading made terrible, perfect sense. According to my mother, there was no wedding anymore. For several minutes after the last vendor call, neither Daniel nor I spoke. The contracts were still spread across the kitchen table, like evidence in a case neither of us had expected to be part of. 3 vendors, 3 cancellations, all done by my mother. Daniel finally broke the silence. "You should call her." I stared at the phone sitting between us on the table. Part of me didn't want to. Not because I was afraid of what she would say, but because I already had a feeling I knew. Still, I picked up the phone and dialed. She answered on the second ring. "Hi, sweetheart," my mother said, her voice warm and completely ordinary. "How are you?" The normal tone of her voice felt almost surreal after everything we had just learned. For a second, I wondered if she really thought nothing had happened. "Why did you cancel the wedding?" I asked. There was no hesitation. "I cancelled a problem," she said calmly. The words landed like a stone in my chest. "That wasn't your decision to make." My mother sighed softly, the way she used to when I was a teenager, and she thought I was being dramatic. "Lena," she said patiently, "someone had to step in before things got worse." Across the table, Daniel's jaw tightened. "You told the vendors the wedding was off," I said. "You told them you were calling for me." "Well," she replied, "I was helping." Helping. The word echoed in my head in a way that made my stomach twist. "You cancelled everything," I said slowly. "Yes." No apology. No hesitation. Just confirmation. For a moment, I didn't know what to say. "You don't get to make that choice for me," I said finally. My mother gave a small laugh on the other end of the phone. "You're still thinking about this, like it's your decision." The sentence hung in the air. "I'm an adult," I said quietly. "And I'm your mother," she replied. Her voice wasn't raised. It wasn't angry. If anything, it sounded calm, certain. You've always had trouble seeing the bigger picture, she continued. You rush into things when you're emotional. My hand tightened around the phone. This has nothing to do with emotion, I said. I'm getting married. No, she said. The word was soft but absolute. You were planning to get married. Daniel's head snapped up slightly when he heard that. You told half the town I'm unstable, I said. I told people I'm worried about you. That's not the same thing. It is when people already see the signs. The quiet certainty in her voice made something inside me sink. She wasn't panicking. She wasn't defending herself. She genuinely believed she had fixed the situation. You went behind my back, I said. I handled a situation you weren't capable of handling. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then, my mother added something that made the entire situation feel even colder. You'll understand eventually. I stared at the wall across the kitchen, trying to process the casual finality in her voice. You canceled my wedding, I said. I prevented a mistake. Daniel leaned forward across the table, disbelief written all over his face. You don't get to control my life, I said quietly. My mother didn't answer immediately. When she finally spoke again, her voice had taken on the same gentle tone she used when ending an argument she believed was already settled. There won't be a wedding, Lena. The certainty in her voice made my chest tighten. You can fight me if you want, she continued. But eventually, you'll see I was right. For a moment, the kitchen felt completely still. You really think this is over? I asked. I know it is. And just like that, I understood something. She wasn't trying to convince me anymore. She thought she had already won. I ended the call without another word. The silence in the kitchen felt heavier than before. Daniel watched me carefully. What did she say? I set the phone down slowly. She thinks there isn't going to be a wedding. Outside the window, the morning sun was climbing higher, lighting the quiet street exactly the way it did every day. But sitting there at the table, staring at the canceled contracts, I felt something else settle in for the first time since all of this started. Not confusion, not even shock anymore. Just the quiet realization that my mother had crossed a line she believed I would never be able to undo. For several seconds after I ended the call, the kitchen felt completely still. Daniel hadn't moved. The stack of canceled contracts still lay between us on the table, like proof of something I still couldn't quite believe had actually happened. My mother had canceled my wedding. Not argued about it. Not threatened it. Canceled it. Daniel finally spoke. What did she say? I swallowed. She thinks it's over. His eyebrows pulled together. She really believes that? I nodded slowly. She thinks there isn't going to be a wedding anymore. Daniel leaned back in his chair, letting out a slow breath. Well, he said quietly, she definitely made that a lot harder. For a moment, neither of us said anything else. The truth was sitting right there in front of us. The venue was gone. The caterer was gone. The florist was gone. Even if we wanted to move forward, rebuilding everything 3 weeks before the wedding felt almost impossible. Then my phone buzzed. Daniel and I both glanced down. The screen lit up with a name that made me pause. Rachel. I answered immediately. Hey. Rachel didn't waste time. Please tell me you already know what your mother did. I blinked. You mean the vendors? So you found out, she said. Daniel leaned forward slightly. How did you know about that? I asked. Rachel let out a breath that sounded almost like relief. Because she called me this morning. I frowned. She called you? Yeah, Rachel said. Apparently, I'm supposed to help you. Come to your senses. Daniel gave a short, humorless laugh. That sounds about right. I leaned back in my chair. So I guess she's telling everyone the wedding's off. Rachel didn't answer right away. Instead, she asked a question. Are you actually canceling it? The idea caught me completely off guard. No, I said immediately. Good, Rachel replied. There was something about the way she said it that made me sit up straighter. Why? I asked. Because if you were about to cancel it, she said. I needed to know before I started setting things in motion. Daniel and I exchanged a quick look. What things? He asked. Rachel was quiet for a moment. Then she said something that made the air in the kitchen shift. I've been preparing for this for a while. My brow furrowed. For what? For the possibility that your mom would try to blow up the wedding. Daniel sat up straighter. You expected this? Not the exact way it happened, Rachel admitted. But Lena, I've known your mother since we were 15. That part was true. Rachel had practically grown up in our house. She had seen the way my mother could turn a celebration into something about control, long before I ever noticed it myself. I started getting nervous when she insisted on taking over the wedding planning, Rachel continued. I felt my stomach drop slightly. That was 6 months ago. Exactly. There was a faint sound of papers shifting on her end of the line. So, while she was busy calling vendors and handling everything, I quietly started looking at alternatives. For a moment, I thought I had misheard her. Alternatives? Backup vendors, backup location, backup schedule. Daniel blinked. You're serious. Rachel gave a small laugh. I didn't think we'd actually need it, she admitted. But I also didn't want Lena standing at an empty venue if something went sideways. My chest tightened at the image. You planned another wedding? I asked slowly. Not another wedding, Rachel corrected. A safety net. Daniel leaned forward. So what exactly are you saying right now? Rachel didn't hesitate. I'm saying the wedding can still happen. The words landed so suddenly that for a moment I couldn't process them. Wait, I said. You mean like, actually happen? Actual venue, actual caterer, actual flowers, Rachel replied. Daniel stared at the phone like it might suddenly start glowing. You're telling me you had all of this ready? I hoped I'd never need it, Rachel said honestly. But yeah, for the first time that morning, something shifted inside my chest. Not relief exactly, but the feeling that the ground beneath my feet might not have completely disappeared after all. So, Rachel said gently, do you want to hear the crazy part? I sat up straighter. What? Rachel's voice dropped into the kind of quiet confidence she always had when she knew she'd outplayed someone. Your mom thinks the wedding is gone. A small pause. But she's the only person who believes that. For a moment after Rachel finished speaking, the kitchen fell quiet again. But it was a different kind of silence this time. Daniel and I were both staring at the phone like the conversation we had just had might somehow change if we replayed it in our heads. Finally, Daniel spoke. Okay, he said slowly. I feel like we're missing several very important details. Rachel laughed softly on the other end of the line. Yeah, probably. There was the sound of a car door closing in the background. Actually, she added, this will make a lot more sense if I show you. Show us what? I asked. My extremely paranoid backup folder. Before I could respond, the call ended. Daniel looked at me. Did she just say paranoid backup folder? I let out a small breath. I think she did. 20 minutes later, we heard a car pull into the driveway. Rachel's blue SUV rolled to a stop outside the house. She climbed out carrying a thick manila folder and a laptop bag slung over her shoulder. When she walked into the kitchen, she gave me a quick look, one that softened slightly when she saw my face. Rough morning? She asked. That's one way to describe it. Rachel nodded once, like she had expected that answer, and dropped the folder onto the table. Okay, she said. Let's go through this. She flipped the folder open. Inside were printed venue brochures, vendor notes, contracts, and several pages of what looked like a carefully organized timeline. Daniel leaned forward slightly. You weren't kidding. Rachel gave a small shrug. I didn't build a whole second wedding or anything, she said. I just made sure there were options. She slid the first sheet across the table. At the top was a venue name I didn't recognize. Elmwood Garden Estate. Private property about 15 minutes outside town, Rachel explained. My cousin helps run events there sometimes. I scanned the page. Garden, ceremony area, covered pavilion, guest capacity. 220. It's beautiful, I said quietly. Rachel nodded. The owner agreed to hold the date when I explained the situation. I put down a small refundable deposit just in case. That detail alone made the entire thing suddenly feel real. Daniel leaned closer to look at the photos. Honestly, this might be nicer than the first venue. Rachel smirked. That's what I thought too. She slid the next page forward. Catering. The name made Daniel blink. Big Jim's Smokehouse? Rachel nodded. They were already booked the same weekend for a smaller event. But when I explained there might be a schedule change, they said they could shift things around if needed. Daniel leaned back with a low whistle. Okay, now I'm impressed. I flipped to the next page. Flowers? Different florist, Rachel said, but they specialize in wildflower arrangements. My chest tightened slightly. That had been exactly what I wanted originally, before my mother replaced everything with white roses. For a moment, I just stared at the page. You did all this months ago, I said quietly. Rachel leaned back against the counter. I hoped I'd never have to use it, she admitted. Then she looked directly at me. I just didn't want you standing in an empty parking lot on your wedding day. The image hit harder than I expected. I reached down and touched the edge of the paper in front of me. You were protecting me, I said softly. Rachel shrugged again, but there was something gentler in her expression now. Just covering possibilities. Daniel crossed his arms thoughtfully. So what happens next? Rachel pulled another sheet from the folder. A printed guest list. Names, phone numbers, emails. I kept the original list you sent me months ago, she said. Before your mom started rearranging everything. Daniel studied it. That's a lot of people. 203, Rachel said. I blinked. And you're going to tell all of them about the new location in one day? Rachel shook her head. Not exactly. She tapped the list. We split the calls. Daniel raised an eyebrow. Calls? Group text for most people, Rachel explained. Personal calls for family and anyone who might not check their phone. I felt something shift inside my chest again. The plan was starting to sound real. Rachel closed the folder slowly. Your mom thinks the wedding disappeared, she said. Daniel nodded. Yeah. Rachel's mouth curved into a small, satisfied smile. So we let her keep believing that. She paused. And then we make sure everyone else shows up somewhere else. For the first time since my mother canceled the wedding, the kitchen didn't feel like a disaster zone. It felt organized. Not calm exactly, but focused. Rachel had spread papers across the table, while Daniel leaned over the guest list, studying it with the same careful attention he used when measuring wood in his workshop. 200 names. 200 people who still believed the wedding was in chaos. Rachel tapped the top of the page with a pen. Okay, she said. Step 1 is controlling the information. Daniel glanced up. Meaning? Meaning we don't tell everyone at once. She slid the guest list toward us. If your mom hears about the new venue too early, she'll try something else. Call vendors again. Call guests. Start rumors. Daniel nodded slowly. Yeah, that sounds like her. Rachel divided the page with quick lines. So we split the list. She circled the first group. Immediate family and closest friends. About 20 people. She looked at Daniel. Your mom, your cousins, Lena's uncle, Rachel's parents, people we trust. They get calls, Daniel said. Exactly. Rachel moved her pen down the page. Group 2 gets a text message Saturday morning. She opened her laptop and turned it toward us. The message was simple, clear. Wedding update. Due to unexpected vendor changes, the ceremony location has moved to Elmwood Garden Estate, 412 Whitfield Lane. Same time, 3 p.m. See you there. Daniel read it twice. That actually sounds normal. That's the goal, Rachel said. No drama. Just a location update. I studied the screen. And the rest? Rachel tapped the final group. Older relatives who might not check their phones. Daniel Seahill. My Uncle Gary. Uncle Gary definitely gets a phone call, Rachel agreed. For the next few minutes we went through the list, name by name. Daniel took responsibility for his side of the family. Rachel volunteered to call several of my relatives. And without really thinking about it, I found myself saying I'd call 2 of my old teachers who had been invited. It was strange. A few hours earlier, I had been sitting on the kitchen floor, convinced my wedding was over. Now, we were quietly rebuilding it together. Daniel suddenly leaned back in his chair. There's still one problem. Rachel raised an eyebrow. Your mom. The room went quiet. Daniel rubbed the back of his neck. She's going to go to the original venue. Rachel nodded. That's very likely. And when she realizes nothing is there. He didn't finish the sentence. But we all understood the rest. My mother would start calling people, trying to figure out what happened, trying to regain control. Rachel closed her laptop slowly. That's why the timing matters, she said. Most guests will already be on their way to Elmwood by then. Daniel looked thoughtful. And if she calls them? Rachel shrugged lightly. Some might answer, some might not. Then she added, but by the time she starts asking questions, the ceremony will already be beginning. The image formed in my mind. Guests arriving through the white gates of the garden. Music starting. Wildflowers lining the aisle. And somewhere across town, my mother standing in an empty parking lot, trying to figure out why the story didn't end the way she expected. Rachel gathered the papers and stacked them neatly. We confirm vendors tomorrow, she said. Daniel nodded. And Saturday morning we moved 200 people. Rachel looked at me. Her voice softened slightly. You okay with all of this? For a moment I didn't answer. I looked at the guest list. At Daniel. At Rachel. And something inside my chest, tight and heavy for days, finally loosened. I thought I was going to lose everything, I said quietly. Rachel shook her head. No, she said. You were just outnumbered for a while. Daniel reached across the table and squeezed my hand. Not anymore. And for the first time since the phone calls from the vendors started, I believed him. Saturday morning arrived faster than I expected. For weeks, the wedding had felt like something fragile, something my mother could crush with a single phone call. But when I woke up that morning in Rachel's guest room, the world outside the window looked strangely normal. Sunlight slipped through the blinds. Somewhere down the street, a lawnmower started. Life had continued, while my life had been falling apart. Rachel was already awake. I could hear her voice in the living room, calm and focused. Yes, hi Mrs. Henderson, yes, that's right. Same time, just a different location. Elmwood Garden Estate. Perfect. See you at 3. She hung up, just as I stepped into the hallway. How many so far? I asked. Rachel checked the sheet in her hand. 23 confirmed calls. Daniel walked in from the kitchen holding 2 coffee mugs. And about 150 texts sent, he added. Rachel nodded. Most people just replied with thumbs-up emojis. For the first time that week, I laughed. Not a nervous laugh. A real one. The plan was moving, piece by piece. By noon, Rachel had finished the last of the personal calls. Daniel checked his phone again. Group text delivery looks good, hardly any bounce backs. Rachel closed her laptop. That's it, she said. The rest is momentum. The 3 of us stood there for a moment, the quiet settling around us. Across town, the original venue still sat empty, and my mother still believed that was where the wedding would be. At 2:30 that afternoon, the gravel road leading to Elmwood Garden Estate began filling with cars. Rachel and Daniel had arrived earlier to help the vendors set up. I stood near the garden entrance, watching the first guests walk through the white wooden gate. Mrs. Henderson pressed both hands to her chest when she saw the wildflower arches. Oh, honey, she whispered. This place is beautiful. Behind her, Daniel's cousin Danny looked around the garden. This is way better than the other venue, he said. People kept arriving. Friends, teachers from the school where I worked. Neighbors who had watched me grow up. They stepped through the gate, paused for a moment in surprise, and then smiled when they saw the decorations Rachel had worked so hard to organize. Sunflowers, lavender, soft string lights hanging between the old oak trees. Everything looked exactly like the wedding I had imagined months ago before my mother had quietly tried to erase it. Daniel appeared beside me, adjusting his jacket. 200 chairs, he said softly, and almost all of them filled. I looked across the garden. Laughter drifted through the warm afternoon air. Guests greeted each other. Someone uncorked a bottle of champagne near the reception table. For the first time since this nightmare began, the day actually felt like a wedding, not a battle. A wedding. The ceremony music started just after 3. As I walked slowly down the aisle, I could see Rachel standing near the back, arms folded, watching everything with quiet satisfaction. Daniel waited beneath the arch of wildflowers, his eyes already shining. Every step felt lighter than the one before it. When I reached him, he took my hands. "You made it," he whispered. "We made it," I corrected. The officiant began speaking, but for a moment my attention drifted beyond the garden walls. 12 minutes away, the original venue still stood silent. An empty parking lot. Rows of unused chairs inside a locked building. And somewhere out there, my mother was probably standing in that empty space, waiting for a wedding that was never going to happen. Back in the garden, the guests leaned forward as the vows began. Daniel squeezed my hand. "I choose you," he said quietly. The applause that followed echoed through the trees. And in that moment, surrounded by the people who had shown up for us, the truth finally became clear. My mother hadn't destroyed my wedding. She had only revealed who truly belonged at it. Sometimes, the people who are supposed to protect us are the ones who try hardest to control us. When that happens, it can make you doubt yourself, your choices, and even your worth. But love should never feel like a cage. Real love supports your growth, celebrates your happiness, and respects your boundaries. If someone uses guilt, fear, or manipulation to keep you small, the most powerful thing you can do is step forward anyway. Surround yourself with people who believe in you, like Rachel and Daniel did for Lena. One loyal friend can change the entire direction of your life. Remember this: you don't need permission to build your own future. The people who truly care about you will walk through the right gate with you, no matter where the path leads.